The studio lights were blinding that evening in Berlin. Hundreds of people packed into the audience seats, their phones already out and recording. This was the night everyone had been waiting for. The semi-final round of Classical Stars, the biggest talent show in Europe for classical musicians. Behind the long judges' table sat 3 people. 2 of them were smiling, chatting with each other between acts, clearly enjoying the show. But the 3rd judge sat differently. Victor Albrecht, one of the most famous conductors in the world, looked almost bored. His arms were crossed over his chest and he kept glancing at his expensive watch as if he had somewhere better to be. Victor had conducted orchestras in Vienna, London, and New York. He had won awards that most musicians only dream about, and he made sure everyone knew it. During the commercial breaks, he would talk loudly about his upcoming performances, dropping names of famous concert halls and important people he knew. The other judges had learned to just nod and smile. The show had been running for 3 hours already. Young pianists, cellists, and violinists had come and gone. Some were brilliant. Some were average. Victor had been harsh with almost all of them. When a 16-year-old girl from Poland played Chopin beautifully, he told her she had acceptable technique but no soul. When a talented boy from Spain performed a complex piece on the cello, Victor said it was technically correct but emotionally empty. The audience didn't like Victor much. You could feel the tension in the room whenever he spoke, but the producers loved him because people tuned in to watch him be mean. That's what made good television, they said. Then came act number 17. 2 small figures walked onto the stage and the audience went quiet. They were young, very young. Twin girls, both 12 years old, with long black hair tied back neatly. They wore matching black dresses that looked formal but simple. Each girl carried a violin case. The girls walked with their heads held high, their steps perfectly synchronized. When they reached center stage, they stopped and bowed together. Exactly at the same time, exactly at the same angle. It was clear they had practiced this moment many times. The host, a friendly man in a shiny suit, walked over to them with his microphone. "Welcome, welcome. Please tell us your names and where you're from." The girl on the left spoke first. "My name is Yuki Takahashi," she said in English with a noticeable accent. Her voice was soft but steady. "And I am Hana Takahashi," said the other girl. "We are from Nagano, Japan." The audience clapped warmly. People always loved seeing young performers, especially ones who came from so far away. "Twins," the host said with exaggerated excitement. "And you both play violin? That's wonderful. Tell me, what will you be performing for us today?" Yuki and Hana looked at each other for a brief moment, then back at the audience. "We will perform an original composition," Yuki said simply. The audience murmured with interest. Original pieces were rare on this show. Most contestants played famous works by dead composers, the safer choice. But Victor? Victor actually laughed. It wasn't a friendly laugh. It was the kind of laugh that made the entire room uncomfortable. The cameras immediately zoomed in on his face, capturing every detail of his smirk. "Original?" he said, his voice dripping with disbelief. He uncrossed his arms and leaned forward on the table. "You're 12 years old." The twins didn't respond. They just stood there, calm and composed. Victor continued, clearly enjoying himself now. "Let me guess. You wrote a little melody at home? Something simple your teacher helped you with?" He glanced at the other judges as if expecting them to laugh along with him. They didn't. "Why don't you play something real first?" Victor said, waving his hand dismissively. "Mozart, perhaps? One of the easier sonatas? Let's see if you can manage that before we waste time on amateur compositions." The audience shifted in their seats. Some people whispered to each other. Others pulled out their phones, sensing that something dramatic was happening. This was the kind of moment that would definitely end up on social media. One of the other judges, a kind-looking woman who taught at a music conservatory, leaned toward her microphone. "Victor, perhaps we should let them—" No, Victor interrupted her. "I'm doing these girls a favor. Better they learn now that this industry requires humility and respect for the masters. You don't just walk onto a stage and claim to have written something worth performing. That's arrogance." The camera kept switching between Victor's face and the twins' faces. What was remarkable was how the girls didn't react. No tears. No anger, no fear. They just stood there, waiting patiently for him to finish talking. Hana finally spoke, her voice even quieter than her sister's. "Should we perform now?" The host, desperate to move things along, jumped in quickly. Yes. Please, whenever you're ready." Victor sat back in his chair with a satisfied smile, like he had already won some kind of argument. He picked up his pen and opened his notebook, the one where he wrote detailed critiques during every performance. He clearly expected this to be quick. Play for a minute, make some mistakes, get sent home. That was how this would go. The twins moved to their positions. They opened their violin cases with careful, practiced movements. The instruments inside were beautiful, old wood that glowed under the stage lights. As they lifted the violins to their shoulders, something shifted in the room. The audience stopped whispering. People sat up straighter. Yuki and Hana stood side by side, about 3 feet apart. They raised their bows at exactly the same moment, like they were controlled by the same mind. Their eyes met briefly and something passed between them, some silent communication that only twins might understand. Then they closed their eyes. For one long second, the entire theater was completely silent. You could hear the air conditioning humming. Someone coughed in the back row. Victor tapped his pen against his notebook, already impatient, and then they began to play. The first note that came from their violins made people catch their breath. It was a single, sustained tone, pure and clear and somehow sad. But not the kind of sad that makes you want to look away, the kind of sad that makes you lean in closer. Victor's pen stopped moving. His eyes, which had been looking down at his notebook, slowly lifted to the stage. The twins began to move their bows in slow, sweeping motions. The melody that emerged was unlike anything most people in that audience had ever heard on this show. It started with something that sounded ancient, like music from another time and place. There were notes that bent and curved in ways that didn't quite fit Western musical scales. It reminded people of wind moving through mountains, of old temples, of stories passed down through generations. But then something changed. The music began to shift, to transform. Western classical elements started weaving into the Eastern melody. Suddenly there were harmonies that Bach might have written but twisted and reimagined. The twins' bows moved faster now, their fingers dancing along the fingerboards with impossible precision. Victor sat completely still. His mouth had fallen slightly open. The pen in his hand was frozen in mid-air. The other judges had similar expressions: shock, confusion, and something like awe. The woman who had tried to defend the twins earlier had tears forming in her eyes. In the audience, phones were being held up everywhere, recording every second. People who knew nothing about classical music could tell they were witnessing something special. People who knew everything about classical music couldn't quite believe what they were hearing. The twins played as one person. When Yuki went high, Hana went low. When Hana played softly, Yuki played strong. They created layers of sound that seemed impossible for just two instruments. Their bodies swayed with the music, their expressions peaceful, almost like they were somewhere else entirely. And Victor? Victor had started writing frantically in his notebook, his pen scratching across the page as he tried to capture what he was hearing. His confident smirk was completely gone now, replaced by something that looked almost like panic, because he was beginning to realize something that terrified him. These 12-year-old girls from a small town in Japan were playing something he didn't understand, something he couldn't quite follow, something that was completely, genuinely, undeniably brilliant, and everyone in that room could see it on his face. The music continued to build, growing more complex with each passing moment. Yuki and Hana moved together like dancers, their bodies swaying in perfect rhythm. Their fingers flew across the strings so fast they became blurs under the bright lights. Yet every single note rang out crystal clear. Victor had filled half a page in his notebook already, his handwriting getting messier and messier. He kept stopping, crossing things out, starting again. His forehead was covered in a thin layer of sweat. The other judges noticed but said nothing. They were too focused on the performance happening in front of them. The woman judge who had tears in her eyes earlier was now crying openly. She didn't even bother wiping the tears away. She just sat there, her hands clasped together, completely absorbed in what she was hearing. In the audience, something magical was happening. People who had been fidgeting in their seats for the past 3 hours sat absolutely frozen. A man in the third row had been checking his phone every few minutes all evening. Now the phone lay forgotten in his lap, its screen dark. A teenage girl who had come with her mother gripped her mother's hand tightly, her mouth slightly open in wonder. The twins reached what sounded like the middle section of their piece. Here the music became softer, more delicate. It was like watching the sunset. beautiful but tinged with sadness. Hana played a melody that sounded like a lullaby, something ancient and comforting. Meanwhile, Yuki wove a counter-melody underneath, supporting her sister's notes while creating something entirely new at the same time. This was the moment when even people who knew nothing about music could tell something extraordinary was happening. The way the two parts intertwined, the way they seemed to have a conversation without words, it was pure magic. Victor stopped writing. His pen hovered over the page, but nothing came out. He was staring at the twins with an expression that was hard to read. Was it confusion? Respect? Fear? Maybe all three at once. One of the camera operators, a man who had worked on this show for 7 seasons, later told reporters that he had filmed thousands of performances. But in that moment, he forgot he was supposed to be working. He just stood there, camera still rolling by luck, watching 2 12-year-old girls create something he had never experienced before. The music began to shift again. Now it started climbing, building toward something bigger. The twins' bows moved faster, their movements becoming more dramatic. The Eastern influences that had started the piece came back. But this time they collided with Western classical techniques in ways that shouldn't have worked but somehow did. There were moments that sounded like Vivaldi, then suddenly they would twist into something that belonged in a traditional Japanese ceremony. 1 second you could hear echoes of Beethoven's Passion. The next second it transformed into scales that Western ears weren't used to hearing. But it all fit together. It all made sense. Victor's mouth had gone completely dry. He reached for the glass of water in front of him and took a sip, but he never took his eyes off the stage. His hand trembled slightly as he set the glass back down. The third judge, an older man who had been a professional violinist for 40 years, leaned back in his chair with his eyes closed. He was listening with his whole body the way true musicians do. A small smile played at the corners of his mouth. He knew what he was hearing. This wasn't just good. This wasn't just impressive for 12-year-olds. This was genuinely world-class. As the piece moved toward its climax, both girls began playing with an intensity that seemed impossible from such small bodies. Their bows attacked the strings, drawing out powerful, ringing notes that filled every corner of the massive theater. The music swelled and surged like ocean waves, each one bigger than the last. People in the audience stopped breathing. Some had goosebumps covering their arms. Others felt their hearts racing in their chests, keeping time with the driving rhythm of the violins. Victor was scribbling again, but now his notes made no sense. He had written the same phrase 3 times. How are they doing this? His carefully cultivated composure had completely shattered. The man who had confidently dismissed these girls minutes ago now looked like a student struggling with homework that was far too advanced. The music hit its peak. Both violins sang out in unison, hitting notes so high and pure they seemed to pierce through everything else. It was the kind of sound that makes your chest feel tight, that makes you want to laugh and cry at the same time. Then, suddenly, it began to wind down. The intensity softened. The music became gentle again, like a storm passing and leaving calm waters behind. The Eastern elements returned, bringing the piece full circle. The twins played the final phrases with such tenderness, such care, that several more people in the audience found themselves crying without knowing exactly why. The last note hung in the air like a bird suspended in flight. Yuki and Hana held their bows perfectly still, keeping that note singing out clearly for what felt like forever. Their eyes were still closed, their faces peaceful. Then silence. For 3 full seconds, nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Nobody made a sound. Then the theater exploded. The audience leaped to their feet as one. The applause was deafening, thunderous, the kind of reaction usually reserved for the finale of major opera performances. People were shouting, cheering, clapping so hard their hands hurt. The teenage girl who had been holding her mother's hand was jumping up and down. The man in the 3rd row was whistling loudly, something he hadn't done since he was young. Yuki and Hana opened their eyes slowly, as if waking from a dream. They looked at each other first, small smiles appearing on their faces. Then they bowed together, the same perfect synchronized movement they had made when they first walked onto the stage. When they straightened up, they were both blinking rapidly, clearly overwhelmed by the response. The woman judge was on her feet, applauding with tears still streaming down her face. The older violinist judge was nodding vigorously, a huge grin on his face as he clapped. But Victor remained seated. He was clapping too, but slowly, mechanically. His face had gone pale. In his lap, his notebook lay open to that page of frantic, messy notes. Notes that captured maybe a quarter of what had actually happened in the piece. Notes that showed in black and white that he had been unable to follow what two 12-year-old girls had just performed. The host rushed onto the stage, his own eyes wide with excitement. The applause continued for over a minute. People in the back rows were still standing, still clapping, not ready for the moment to end. Finally, the host managed to get the audience to quiet down enough that he could speak. That was absolutely incredible," he said, his voice full of genuine emotion. "Ladies and gentlemen, Yuki and Hana Takahashi." Another wave of applause. The twins bowed again. The host turned to the judges' table. "Judges, I think we're all eager to hear your thoughts. Let's start with..." He paused, making a dramatic choice. "Maestro Albrecht." The camera zoomed in on Victor's face. He looked like a man who had just been told his entire worldview was wrong. He cleared his throat once, then again. He glanced down at his useless notes, then back up at the twins. He started, then stopped. The whole theater waited. That was technically proficient. The audience's mood shifted immediately. Some people booed softly. Others made confused sounds. After what they had just witnessed, technically proficient felt like an insult. Victor continued, his voice gaining strength as he fell back on his expertise, his authority. "You clearly have good hand-eye coordination. Your intonation was mostly accurate. Your bowing technique shows proper training." The other judges were staring at him in disbelief. The woman judge opened her mouth to say something, then closed it again. "But," Victor went on, and now his voice had that edge of superiority back, "any trained musician can perform what they've practiced. What they've memorized. That's not artistry. That's just repetition." He stood up from the judges' table. The audience went silent again, but this time it was a different kind of silence. This was anticipation mixed with tension. Something was about to happen. Victor straightened his expensive jacket and started walking toward the stage. His shoes clicked loudly on the floor, click, click, click. Each step echoed through the theater. "What I want to see," he said, his voice carrying across the room, "is whether you actually understand what you just played. Whether you can read music or if you've just memorized finger positions." He reached the stage and climbed the stairs. Yuki and Hana watched him approach, their expressions unreadable. Victor stopped a few feet away from them and crossed his arms again. "I want to see the sheet music," he declared. "The actual notation for this piece you claim to have written." The host looked uncertain, glancing between Victor and the twins. "Maestro, I'm not sure if..." "I'll sight read it myself," Victor interrupted. "Right here, right now. If this piece is as complex as you all seem to think, then surely the notation will reflect that. And if I, with my 40 years of experience, can sight read it easily, then perhaps we can all agree that this performance, while pretty, was not quite the miracle everyone seems to think it was." The challenge hung in the air. The audience understood what was happening. Victor's pride had been wounded, and he was trying to take back control of the situation. Yuki looked at her sister. Hana nodded slightly. Then Yuki turned to Victor and said in her soft, accented voice, "Okay." She walked calmly to the side of the stage where they had left their belongings. From a simple black bag, she pulled out a folder. She walked back to Victor and held it out to him. Victor took it with a confident smile. He was already imagining how this would go. He would sight read their little piece perfectly, show everyone that it wasn't that complicated, and restore his reputation as the expert in the room. He opened the folder and pulled out the pages of sheet music. His smile began to fade. The music was written in standard Western notation, yes. But intertwined with it were symbols and markings he didn't immediately recognize. Japanese characters appeared throughout, integrated into the staff lines themselves. Time signatures changed multiple times per page. There were notations for techniques he had seen before, but never in these combinations. Victor walked over to the grand piano that sat at the side of the stage. It was always there for piano performances, but now it would serve a different purpose. He sat down on the bench and arranged the sheets on the music stand. The audience leaned forward collectively. Every phone in the room was recording now. Victor placed his fingers on the keys. He glanced at the first line of music. It started simply enough. He could handle this. He began to play. The opening bars came out adequately. They weren't beautiful like when the twins had played them on violin, but they were correct. Victor's confidence ticked up slightly. Then he reached the first transition. His fingers stumbled. He stopped, went back, started again. The notation system was confusing him. Those Japanese characters, what did they mean? Were they indicating dynamics? Technique? Something else entirely? He pushed forward, determined. But the further he got into the piece, the more he struggled. His playing became choppy, uncertain. He would play a few measures, then pause to study the page, then try again. The audience watched in absolute silence. This was excruciating. This was fascinating. This was impossible to look away from. 3 minutes into his attempt, Victor reached the section where the Eastern and Western elements truly collided. His hands hovered over the keys, frozen. He stared at the notation, his eyes moving back and forth across the page. Nothing made sense. The hybrid system the twins had created required understanding both musical languages simultaneously, and Victor only spoke one. His hands dropped into his lap. The silence in the theater was crushing. "This notation," he said finally, his voice sounding strained. "It's not standard." From behind him came Hana's voice, gentle but clear. "It's perfectly standard," she said. "If you understand both languages of music." Victor turned to look at her. The twins stood together, holding their violins, their faces calm and patient. And in that moment, captured perfectly by a dozen cameras, everyone watching saw the truth written on Victor Albrecht's face. He had met his match. And he knew it. The show ended 40 minutes later, but nobody in that theater could stop talking about what had happened. People crowded in the lobby, replaying the videos on their phones, watching Victor's face as he failed to play the piece over and over again. Some felt sorry for him. Most didn't. The producers made a decision right there in the control room. Usually episodes aired a week after filming to allow time for editing. But they knew they had television gold. They moved the air date up to 2 days later on Friday night at prime time. But they didn't account for one thing. Someone in that audience had already uploaded a clip to social media. By the time Yuki and Hana were back in their hotel room that night, their performance had been viewed 50,000 times. By morning, it was over 2 million. By the time the actual episode aired on Friday, the clip had been watched by more than 20 million people across every platform imaginable. The internet did what the internet does best. It picked sides. It created memes. It had opinions, very loud opinions. Most people were on the twins' side. Comments flooded in from around the world. "Those girls are incredible," wrote someone from Brazil. "This made me cry," said a music teacher from Canada. "I've been playing violin for 30 years and I couldn't do what they did," admitted a professional musician from Australia. But the really viral part? That was Victor, his dismissive laugh at the beginning, his condescending words, his smug face, and then most importantly his complete inability to play the piece he had mocked. Someone made a compilation video showing just those moments and it exploded online. Conductor humbled by twin prodigies became the #1 trending topic worldwide. Victor's name was everywhere, and not in a good way. People dug up interviews where he had made similar dismissive comments about young musicians. They found articles where he had criticized modern approaches to classical music. They discovered a pattern of arrogance that many in the classical music world had tolerated for years because he was talented and famous. Now, the tolerance was gone. The Berlin Philharmonic, where Victor was scheduled to conduct next month, started receiving angry emails and calls. The Vienna Symphony, where he was a regular guest conductor, issued a carefully worded statement saying they were reviewing their upcoming schedule. 3 different music festivals quietly removed his name from their promotional materials. But something else was happening too, something more important than Victor's falling reputation. Music professors and professional musicians started analyzing the twins' composition. A well-known conductor in Tokyo downloaded the video and watched it repeatedly, taking notes. She then posted a 15-minute video breaking down what made the piece so special. "This isn't just a child's composition," she explained to her 100,000 followers. "This is a genuine fusion of Eastern and Western classical traditions. The notation system they've created? It's brilliant. It allows for techniques and expressions that traditional Western notation can't fully capture." A music theory professor at a prestigious university in London did something similar. He paused the video at different points, zooming in on the twins' finger positions, analyzing their technique. "The level of skill here is extraordinary," he said. "But more than that, the compositional structure shows a deep understanding of both Japanese traditional music and European classical forms. This is graduate-level work. This is doctoral-level work. And they're 12. Then the journalists started digging deeper. They wanted to know who these twins were. Where did they come from? Who taught them? How did two 12-year-old girls from a small town in Japan create something that stumped one of Europe's most famous conductors? A reporter from a major music magazine managed to get an interview with the twins' grandmother. Her name was Akiko Takahashi, and she lived in Nagano, the same small city where Yuki and Hana grew up. She was 78 years old with silver hair and kind eyes that looked remarkably like her granddaughters. The interview was conducted in Japanese and later translated. What Akiko revealed changed everything. "My husband was Kenji Takahashi," she said quietly, sitting in her modest living room. Behind her on the wall hung a photograph of a serious-looking man holding a violin. He was a composer and violinist, a brilliant one, though the world never recognized it. She explained that Kenji had studied Western classical music in Japan, then moved to Europe in his 20s to pursue his dreams. He wanted to be taken seriously as a composer, to have his works performed by major orchestras. But he faced rejection after rejection. Not because his music wasn't good, everyone who heard it admitted it was technically excellent, but because it was too Japanese, they said. It didn't fit what European audiences expected from classical music. Some conductors told him to write more Western if he wanted to succeed. Others suggested he focus on traditional Japanese music instead, and leave classical composition to Europeans. Kenji spent 30 years trying. He submitted compositions to competitions and was turned away. He approached conductors and was politely dismissed. He wrote letters to orchestras and received form rejections in return. A few of his pieces were performed at small venues, but never on the big stages he dreamed of. The constant rejection broke something in him. He became bitter, sad, but he never stopped composing. In his final years, he started working on something different. He began developing a new way to write music, a notation system that could honor both his Japanese heritage and his classical training. A system that didn't ask musicians to choose between East and West, but allowed them to embrace both. He called it the bridge. Kenji died 5 years ago, before he could complete his work. His notebooks and compositions were packed away in boxes in Akiko's home. Then one day, when Yuki and Hana were 7 years old, they found the boxes. They were supposed to be cleaning the attic, Akiko said with a small smile. Instead, they spent 3 hours looking through their grandfather's papers. They came down covered in dust, holding his notebooks, asking me what all the symbols meant. Akiko had been a professional violinist before she married Kenji. She understood music deeply. She could have told the girls to put the notebooks away, that they were too young to understand. Instead, she started teaching them. "I taught them Western classical technique the traditional way," she explained. "But I also taught them Japanese traditional music, folk songs, ceremonial pieces, the music that flows in our blood. And I showed them what their grandfather had been trying to do, how he wanted to bring these worlds together." For 5 years, the girls practiced. They studied both traditions intensely. They took their grandfather's incomplete notation system and, with fresh young minds unburdened by the rules of how music should be written, they completed it. They made it work. The piece they performed on television, Bridge Between Worlds, was built on their grandfather's foundation. They had taken his ideas, his dreams, his unfinished work, and brought it to life. When this story broke, the video went even more viral. This wasn't just about two talented kids anymore. This was about legacy, about dreams deferred, about systemic bias in the classical music world, about how talent from certain places and certain people was dismissed simply because it didn't fit narrow expectations. People who had never cared about classical music suddenly cared deeply about this story. The video of the twins' performance was now approaching 100 million views. Music was so much bigger than he had ever allowed himself to believe. That's when he contacted the Berlin Philharmonic with an unusual request. He wanted to conduct again, but only if it could be a performance of Bridge Between Worlds with Yuki and Hana as the featured performers. The orchestra's management was skeptical. Victor's reputation was still damaged. Would this look like a publicity stunt? Would the twins even agree? But Victor insisted. "I'm not doing this to save my career," he told them. "I'm doing this because this piece deserves to be heard by a full orchestra, and because I need to make things right." So they sent the invitation. Now, 6 weeks later, Victor stood in the rehearsal hall of the Berlin Philharmonic waiting for the twins to arrive. The orchestra members were setting up, tuning their instruments, chatting with each other. They knew what had happened 3 months ago. Everyone knew. They watched their conductor curiously, wondering how this would play out. Victor was nervous. His hands were actually shaking slightly. He couldn't remember the last time he'd felt nervous before a performance. The door opened. Yuki and Hana walked in, followed by their grandmother. They wore simple black dresses and carried their violin cases. They looked so small in the large rehearsal space. The room went quiet. Everyone watched. Victor walked toward them. He stopped a few feet away and did something that shocked everyone in that room. He bowed, a deep, respectful bow, the kind of bow that means something. "Thank you for coming," he said quietly. "I know I don't deserve your presence here, but I'm grateful for it." The twins looked at each other, then bowed back, not as deeply but respectfully. "We're happy to play grandfather's music," Yuki said. Victor nodded. Then he said, "Before we begin, I need to say something. 3 months ago, I treated you with disrespect. I dismissed your talent, your work, and your grandfather's legacy. I was wrong. Completely wrong. And I'm truly sorry." The orchestra members exchanged glances. Some seemed moved. Others remained skeptical. Public apologies could be calculated things, but Victor wasn't finished. "Since that night, I've been studying. Really studying. Not just your notation system, but the traditions behind it. The history, the cultural context. I worked with a teacher in Tokyo who helped me understand what I should have understood years ago, that there are many languages of music, and mine was just one small dialect." He looked directly at the twins. "I don't claim to be an expert now. I'm still learning. I'll probably always be learning. But I understand your piece now. I understand what your grandfather was trying to do. And I promise you, I will conduct this orchestra with all the respect and care that his work deserves." There was silence in the hall. Then Hana, who rarely spoke up, said something that surprised everyone. "Our grandfather would have liked you." Victor looked confused. "Why? I was exactly the kind of person who rejected his work." "Yes," Hana said simply. "But you learned. You changed." That's what he always hoped people would do. Victor felt his throat tighten. He nodded, not trusting himself to speak. Akiko stepped forward. "Shall we begin rehearsal?" They spent the next 4 hours working through the piece. Victor led the orchestra with careful attention, stopping frequently to check with the twins about dynamics and interpretation. He asked their opinion. He listened to their answers. He adjusted based on what they said. The orchestra members began to relax. This didn't feel like a publicity stunt. This felt real. During a break, one of the violinists approached the twins. She was a young woman from Korea who had faced her own challenges breaking into the European classical music scene. "Thank you," she said quietly to Yuki and Hana, "for what you did, for what you're doing." "It matters more than you know," Yuki smiled. "We just played our grandfather's music." "You did more than that," the violinist said. "You opened a door. Now it's easier for others like us to walk through." Similar conversations happened throughout the rehearsal breaks. Orchestra members shared their own stories. A cellist from Brazil talked about being told his playing was too emotional for classical music. A flutist from Egypt described years of being asked to play exotic pieces instead of standard repertoire. A pianist from China mentioned conductors who seemed surprised she could play Chopin. The twins listened to all of it. They were beginning to understand that their grandfather's struggle hadn't been unique, that their performance on television had touched something deeper than just one viral moment. As the rehearsal ended, Victor gathered everyone together. "Next week," he said, "we'll perform this piece for a live audience. It won't just be a concert. It will be a statement about what classical music can be, about who gets to participate in it, about how we move forward." He looked at the twins. "Yuki, Hana, your grandfather spent his life building a bridge. Next week, we're going to walk across it together." The twins nodded. And for the first time since arriving in Berlin, they seemed genuinely excited. The concert was 1 week away. The tickets had sold out in less than an hour. News organizations from around the world had requested press passes. Everyone wanted to see what would happen when Victor Albrecht shared a stage with the twins he had once mocked. Would it be redemption? Would it be reconciliation? Would it be the beginning of something new? Only the performance would tell. The night of the concert arrived with Berlin wrapped in a light snow. Outside the Philharmonic Hall, hundreds of people gathered despite the cold. Some had tickets. Many didn't, but they wanted to be there anyway, to be part of whatever was about to happen. Inside, the concert hall looked magnificent. Every seat was filled. The audience was different from typical classical music crowds. Yes, there were the usual older patrons in formal wear, the ones who attended every major performance. But there were also young people, families, musicians who had traveled from across Europe and beyond. There were Japanese community members from Berlin wearing traditional clothing. There were music students with notebooks ready to study every moment. In the front row sat several important figures from the classical music world. Critics who had written about the viral incident. Conductors who had publicly supported or criticized Victor. Representatives from major orchestras and conservatories. They were all here to witness what would happen next. Backstage, Yuki and Hana stood with their grandmother in a quiet dressing room. They wore beautiful traditional Japanese kimono-style dresses that Akiko had made specially for this night. The fabric was deep blue with silver embroidery that caught the light. They looked elegant and confident. "Are you nervous?" Akiko asked them. Yuki shook her head. "We've played this piece 100 times. 1,000 times, Hana corrected with a small smile. "Tonight is different, though," Akiko said. "The whole world is watching." "That's okay," Yuki said. "Grandfather's music can handle it." There was a knock on the door. A stagehand peeked in. 5 minutes. The twins picked up their violins. Akiko hugged them both. "Your grandfather would be so proud," she whispered. "I'm so proud." Down the hall, Victor stood alone in his own dressing room. He was already in his formal conductor's attire, black tails, white shirt, perfectly tied bow tie. He looked at himself in the mirror and barely recognized the person staring back. 3 months ago, he had been so certain of everything, so confident in his knowledge, his status, his superiority. That person seemed like a stranger now. His phone buzzed. A message from Yumi, his teacher in Tokyo. "Remember, listen as much as you lead. The music will guide you." Victor smiled and replied, "Thank you. For everything." Another knock. "Maestro, it's time." Victor took a deep breath and walked out. The orchestra was already seated on stage when he arrived. They watched him walk to the conductor's podium. The audience applauded politely, though there was tension in the sound. People weren't sure how to react to him yet. Victor stepped up to the podium and turned to face the crowd. The applause faded. The hall became quiet enough to hear the snow tapping against the high windows. "Good evening," Victor said, his voice clear but humble. "Before we begin, I want to say a few words." Some people in the audience shifted uncomfortably. Others leaned forward with interest. 3 months ago, I made a terrible mistake," Victor continued. "I allowed my arrogance and my narrow view of music to blind me to something beautiful. I dismissed 2 young artists whose talent and vision far exceeded my understanding. But more than that, I dismissed the legacy of their grandfather, Kenji Takahashi, a composer who deserved recognition he never received." The hall was completely silent now. Even the orchestra members sat perfectly still. "I cannot undo what I did," Victor said, "but I can try to do better. I spent these past months learning, really learning, about musical traditions beyond my own training. I studied with teachers who were generous enough to educate someone who should have known better long ago. And I came to understand that classical music doesn't belong to any one culture, any one tradition, any one way of thinking." He paused, looking out at the diverse audience. "Tonight we perform Bridge Between Worlds, composed by Kenji Takahashi and completed by his granddaughters, Yuki and Hana. This piece represents something important, not just musical innovation, but a vision of what music can be when we stop building walls and start building bridges." The audience began to applaud. It started softly, then grew stronger. People stood. Within seconds, the entire hall was on its feet, applauding before the music had even begun. Victor turned back to the orchestra, visibly moved. He waited for the applause to fade and for people to sit back down. Then he gestured toward the wings. "Please welcome Yuki and Hana Takahashi." The twins walked onto the stage together, their violins in hand. The audience erupted again. This time the applause was thunderous, full of genuine warmth and excitement. People whistled and cheered. Several members of the Japanese community in attendance wiped away tears. Yuki and Hana bowed together, then took their positions at the front of the orchestra. They stood side by side, just as they had 3 months ago on that television stage. But this was different. This time they were surrounded by world-class musicians who had spent a week learning their grandfather's notation system. This time they had a full orchestra ready to bring every layer of the composition to life. Victor raised his baton. The hall fell silent. Every eye was fixed on him, on the twins, on the musicians ready to play. He brought the baton down. The music began softly, with just the string section creating a gentle, almost ethereal sound. Then the twins joined in, their violins singing out the melody that started everything. The orchestra supported them perfectly, adding depth and richness without overwhelming the two young soloists. As the piece developed, you could hear gasps from the audience. The full orchestral arrangement revealed layers that had been hidden in the original violin duet. When the woodwinds entered with a traditional Japanese-influenced passage, people leaned forward in their seats. When the brass section added Western classical harmonies that somehow fit perfectly with the Eastern melodies, several music professors in the audience frantically scribbled notes. Victor conducted with complete focus. He wasn't showing off, wasn't making dramatic gestures to draw attention to himself. He was serving the music, helping the orchestra navigate the complex hybrid notation system, bringing out the subtle balance between traditions that made the piece work. The twins played with absolute confidence. They had lived with this music for 5 years. It was part of them. When they reached the emotional middle section, Hana's violin sang out a melody so beautiful that people throughout the audience felt tears forming. Yuki's accompanying harmony wrapped around her sister's notes like an embrace. The orchestra members, many of whom had been skeptical during early rehearsals, now played with genuine passion. The Korean violinist from the rehearsal had tears streaming down her face as she played. The Brazilian cellist was completely immersed in the music. The Egyptian flutist hit every note with perfect clarity and feeling. As the piece built toward its climax, the entire hall seemed to vibrate with sound. The fusion of musical traditions wasn't just working, it was transcendent. You could hear Kenji Takahashi's dream coming to life. Every note proving that the boundaries between musical cultures were artificial, that beauty could emerge from combination rather than separation. Victor had studied the piece for months, but even he was discovering new things in this moment. With a full orchestra, with perfect acoustics, with an audience that understood the significance of what they were hearing, the music revealed depths he hadn't imagined. The final section arrived. The twins and orchestra moved together through the complex conclusion, bringing Eastern and Western elements into perfect unity. The last notes built and built, then finally resolved in a chord that somehow felt like both a question and an answer. Victor held his baton perfectly still, keeping that final chord hanging in the air for 1 eternal second. Then he lowered his arms. Silence. 3 seconds of complete, breathless silence. Then the hall exploded with applause unlike anything the Berlin Philharmonic had heard in its long history. Everyone was on their feet instantly. People weren't just clapping, they were shouting, crying, embracing each other. The applause went on, waves of sound that matched the waves of music that had just washed over them. Victor turned to face the twins. His eyes were wet with tears. He bowed to them. A deep, respectful bow that acknowledged everything. His past mistakes, their grace, their grandfather's genius, the bridge they had built together. Yuki and Hana bowed back, then they did something unexpected. They reached out and took Victor's hands, pulling him forward to bow with them to the audience. The 3 of them stood together, accepting the applause as partners, as equals. The orchestra stood and applauded too. The Korean violinist was openly sobbing. Other musicians hugged each other, overcome with emotion. The applause continued for 7 minutes. 7 full minutes of people refusing to stop celebrating what they had witnessed. Critics who had come to judge found themselves crying. Orchestra representatives who had come out of obligation found themselves genuinely moved. Young musicians who had come to learn found themselves inspired. Finally, the applause began to fade. People started sitting down, though many kept wiping their eyes. Victor stepped forward to the microphone one more time. "What you just heard," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "was the result of love. Kenji Takahashi's love for music, his granddaughter's love for him, and their love for a dream that music could unite rather than divide." He paused. "This piece will be published. The notation system will be taught. Kenji Takahashi's name will be remembered, and I truly hope, that this moment marks a change in how we think about classical music. Not as something belonging to one culture, but as something that grows richer when all cultures contribute." More applause, this time mixed with many voices calling out agreement. In the weeks that followed, everything changed. The recording of the concert was released and streamed millions of times. Music schools around the world began incorporating the Takahashi notation system into their curriculum. Young composers started experimenting with cross-cultural fusions, inspired by what the twins had shown was possible. Yuki and Hana started a foundation in their grandfather's name. It provided scholarships for young musicians from underrepresented backgrounds, helping them access training and opportunities, regardless of where they came from or what musical traditions they represented. Within a year, they had funded over 50 scholarships. Victor's career recovered, but in a different form. He was no longer the arrogant maestro commanding orchestras. He became an advocate, using his platform to champion diverse voices in classical music. He gave lectures at universities about cultural humility. He programmed works by composers from around the world in his concerts. He became known not for his brilliance, but for his willingness to learn and grow. Most importantly, he maintained a relationship with Yuki, Hana, and Akiko. They corresponded regularly. He visited them in Japan once. They taught him more about Japanese musical traditions. He introduced them to colleagues across Europe. It was a genuine friendship built on mutual respect. The twins grew older, their talent continuing to develop. But they never forgot why they played music. It wasn't about fame or recognition. It was about honoring their grandfather's dream and building bridges for others to cross. And somewhere in concert halls around the world, musicians continued to play Bridge Between Worlds. Every performance was a reminder that the best music doesn't come from staying within comfortable boundaries. It comes from having the courage to cross them, to learn from each other, to build something new together. The bridge Kenji Takahashi imagined and his granddaughters built was no longer just a composition. It was a movement. It was a change in how people thought about music, culture, and respect, and it all started because two 12-year-old girls walked onto a stage and refused to accept that their grandfather's dream was impossible. They proved that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply share what you love, play what you believe in, and trust that the right people will listen, even if those people need to learn how to listen first.